somehow Catherine and I have managed not to tread on each other's toes too much, and I hope that this talk will also persuade you that it's possible to come at this information from slightly different angles. At the end of the talk, I will come sort of back around a bit to talking about the way in which the Greek alphabet inscriptions can tell us about contact between Greek speakers and Oscan speakers, and actually, which I'm sure kind of Catherine implied throughout, but I'll just make explicit, these are not necessarily different people, right? It's quite plausible that Greek speakers are also Oscan speakers and vice versa in this area. The kind of thing that I'm most interested in, this is just kind of yet another map with yet another line across it. This doesn't seem to be working at all now, so I can't point these out. With yet another line across it telling you where the, more or less the line is where people stop using the Greek alphabet and start using the Oscan alphabet above it. So the thing that I'm most interested in is basically when they're writing Oscan and doing it in the Greek alphabet, how do they actually spell Oscan? Right? What are the rules if you want to write down Oscan for spelling that language? And another map you've already seen. And I'll come to kind of suggest that maybe there aren't a huge number of rules. But first of all, I want to kind of try my best to persuade you that this is an interesting question. And it's an interesting question not only because I'm the sort of person who likes gathering together every example of E in inscriptions and seeing all the different ways they spell it, but also that it's interesting from the point of view of someone who is an archaeologist or historian, or someone who is a linguist, albeit probably a linguist who's interested in Oscan, and so forth. So why should we be interested in actually studying the orthography, the spelling system, what letters they use to spell what in the Greek alphabet? Well, the first and kind of obvious reason is it'd be nice to know what the inscriptions actually say. We've dug these things up out of the ground, or rather we haven't, but other people have dug them up out of the ground, and they may have all sorts of information to give us about all sorts of aspects of life in South Italy between 400 BC and whenever, 50 BC, whatever we want to call it. So it's important if we understand how the spelling of them works, because a lot of the time when we try and understand these inscriptions, we don't have that much to go on. The most obvious thing to do is to look at inscriptions written in other alphabets in Oscan, so either the Latin alphabet or the Oscan alphabet that Catherine's already mentioned, and see if the words seem to appear in any of those inscriptions. Given that we more or less understand the things that are in those inscriptions, that's great, because now we understand that word, give or take. But a lot of the time we find new words in the inscriptions. And the thing we have to do then is essentially take a comparative linguistic approach. We have to say, what is a plausible understanding of this word on the basis of how we understand relationships between Oscan and, let's say, Latin, or Oscan and Umbrian as being the kind of nearest languages to it, and then further out to other Indo-European languages. So an etymological comparative approach. If we don't understand what the sounds are that could be being represented in these words very well, then we can't do that, essentially, or at least it might be quite problematic. Similarly, if we're interested in doing, let's say, work on the morphology of Oscan or the syntax of Oscan, if we don't understand how those bits of words, the endings of words, for example, fit together, we can't do that very easily. So my first idea is to try and work out what the spelling rules are so we can understand these inscriptions. So if we have a word like anafakit, which actually appeared in Catherine's, one of Catherine's pictures, it was the helmet that was over here with two lines of Oscan written right to left. Does anafaked mean dedicated, which is what the majority of people think it means, or does it mean dedicates, which a minority of people think it means? Right? In a sense, a very minor question, but still one that's worthy of investigation. And the way you can tell that, one of the ways you can tell it is by understanding what does a T represent, a tau at the end of the word, represent when we're using this, what does an epsilon, the second last word, represent, or what can it represent? And actually, I would say the morphology of the word could mean either dedicates or dedicated, which doesn't necessarily take us very far forward, but at least we know that the spelling rules say that it could be either. Perhaps more importantly, when we have words that end in the sequence omega mu, are those words accusative singulars, which in Indo-European terms end in om, or are they genitive plurals, which in Indo-European words end in om? Right? Now, I should imagine that all of you who do ancient Greek are screaming now, it's obvious, it's om, right? Okay. Incidentally, they could also be infinitives. And this is quite an important case, because when we have an inscription like this, which is probably, our fourth longest inscription in the Greek alphabet, in Oscan, I should think, there are no word dividers in this form, or very few. And rather distressingly, we understand almost nothing of this inscription. The first word is pot, which actually is a word that we know from elsewhere, from other Oscan inscriptions, but I don't think, there's this word here, licet, which is equivalent to Latin licet, it is allowed. I think those are the only two words in this inscription that we actually understand kind of straight off the bat. But there are lots of words in it which end in om. So we have here walla home, we have another om here, capiditome, one over here, and so on and so forth. Bratome over here. Oh, we understand bratome. And if at least we know whether this is a text that's full of accusative singulars or genitive plurals, that might make quite a big difference to how we interpret what's happening there. And to put you all out of your misery, right, they have to be accusative singulars. They aren't the genitive plurals in om, they're the accusative singulars in om. So this is what I would say is the first reason to study this sort of thing. Okay. I've basically already said this. I am, with sort of one of my hats on, a historical linguist interested in Oscan, and in particular in Oscan phonology, in the sounds of Oscan, and knowing what the inscriptions say and what sounds, for me, in this particular case, are represented in them, isn't important. It adds extra useful information. So for many, for example, clusters of sounds, the evidence that we have in the Oscan alphabet and the Greek alphabet is actually not that much. We have probably somewhere in the region of 400 or 500 inscriptions overall. Right? Some sounds are going to be very common in that, and we kind of know what happened from a historical linguist perspective to those. Some of them, especially for clusters, we might only have 1, 2, 3 instances in the rest of our evidence. So if we can understand the spelling of these inscriptions, we can also understand what clusters are involved and what happened to them. We can also see if... So Catherine referred to these inscriptions throughout as South Oscan, which I've been rather carefully not doing. There is a certain amount of evidence that the people down here in the south spoke a different dialect of Oscan in some regards. So, for example, anafakhet over here, part of the reason why we can't tell if it's a present or a perfect on the face of it is because that tau there, if it were further north in the Oscan alphabet, if it were a present, you'd write it with a D. Sorry, a T. And if it was a past, you'd write it with a D. They're just different endings. Down here, final D seems to have got confused with final T. So you just end up writing, you just write a mixture. Sometimes you write D, sometimes you write T. You get all mixed up. So it looks as if there is actually a dialectal area here as well. Part of understanding the linguistics of Oscan is, can we identify traits which seem to be dialectal variants? Well, we can't really do that unless we understand how the alphabet and how the writing system works. So this is a kind of another reason to study it. The one that I hope will be of particular interest to historians and archaeologists is that, in particular, the Oscan inscriptions written in the Greek alphabet are very hard to date. There are basically kind of 3 or 4 criteria that are used to date them. Right? One is the archaeological context that they come from. But the problem is a lot of these, or some of these, turned up prior to sort of modern archaeological techniques, so we don't have good archaeological evidence for them. Some of them turned up, a huge number turned up in the site at Rossano di Vaglia, starting in the late 60s and carrying on through the early 70s. But there is debate as to how the people who published them dated them on the basis of the archaeology, which I am in no way qualified to adjudicate. All I know is that people disagree about it. Even the people who published them say, actually, on the archaeological basis, we can't date these very well at all. A lot of them were reused. At some point, the building was redone, and the inscriptions were reused in building it. So that's kind of mucked things up a bit. So archaeology is great when we have it, but we don't have that many cases of it. One way of dating inscriptions is on linguistic grounds. So in other words, you say, oh, well, linguistically, this form must be old, ergo, the inscription itself is old. I think we can reliably do that for one inscription of our 100 or however many there are. So useful as far as it goes, but it doesn't go very far. So that leaves us with dating on the basis of letter shapes and on the basis of orthography. So Catherine mentioned, we have different shapes of F, we have different shapes of S. If I've remembered what my next, I have remembered what my next slide is. Then I'll have an example of dating by letter shapes. We've already mentioned the ones that Catherine talked about. Here is a bronze law tablet from Rocca Gloriosa, which I think was the not very large amounts of legal text that Catherine mentioned in her talk. This is it. It's written on both sides, though, so this is probably the longest text that we have written in the Greek alphabet of Oscan. Unfortunately, it was about 6 times bigger and is broken on both of these sides and on the top. So I think the maximum number of words, whole words we have, is 3 across there. And we have lots of broken words on either side. Nonetheless, it's pretty good by these standards. Incidentally, Catherine and I wrote a very nice article, and I say so myself, about this word, wurust, arguing that it showed that this was a text, or this bit of the text involved what you do when someone nicks something off you and you find it in their possession. Anyway, I've gone off track horribly now. So I was talking about dating with letter signs. Catherine's already mentioned that this is not very reliable. Here we have one kind of H up here. Here we have another kind of H down here. So one that looks like a proper H and one with the side stroke missing. If you read people like Lejeune and Crawford, who did the recent edition of these things, they will say sort of proper H turns into half H at some point, call it 300 BC, 250 BC, and this is a way of dating texts. Well, pretty obviously, if the same text has both, and this text is helpfully dated to 300 to 200 BC, given that our texts only run from about 400 to about 100, that actually gives us a pretty broad span and doesn't particularly help. And we know, so this is something that is also probably important. This half H, this I think may be the earliest example of half H in an Oscan inscription. But we have examples of half H in Greek inscriptions from at least 100 years earlier, from at least 400 BC. So, given that actually the Oscan alphabet doesn't seem to be fixed in aspic, it seems to just be part of a general knowledge of the Greek alphabet that applies whether you're writing in Oscan or Greek. Right? There isn't, in this sense, a separate Oscan alphabet. When the Greek alphabet everywhere changes, it affects everything, regardless of what language you're writing in. Given all that, the fact that we already have half H from 400 BC in a Greek inscription from Italy means that there seems no reason not to suppose that you could use half H in an Oscan inscription by 400 BC as well. So this kind of letter shape dating is a big problem. And that leads us to orthographic dating. So, for example, you say things like, well, Oscan had a vowel E, but they changed how they decided to spell that E. Prior to 300 BC, they spelled that epsilon iota. Post 300 BC, they spelt it, I've got it the wrong way around. Pre 300 BC, they spelt it with epsilon. Post 300 BC, they spelt it with epsilon iota. Now, that has further implications because they also have a diphthong, A. And what you say is, prior to 300 BC, they spelt that epsilon iota, i.e. the same as after 300 BC, they would be spelling the vowel E. When they decide to spell the vowel E with epsilon iota, they switch to spelling the diphthong eta iota. Right? So Michel Lejeune, who came up with this way of orthographic dating, these are all kind of interlinked, and you have this two sets of quite complex interlinked systems that change around 300 BC. Well, this inscription actually spells the vowel A in 3 different ways. Right? And I'll show you them later. But that suggests that orthographic dating is a big problem. And when orthographic dating is your major way of dating these inscriptions, what happens is you decide how it works, and you then date new inscriptions on the basis of the system you've already set up. And when Lejeune set up this system, only 1/3 of the Greek alphabet inscriptions that we have now had been discovered. So most of them are dated on the basis of orthographic rules or systems that were deduced from only 1/3 of the original information. So what I hope is that people who aren't necessarily particularly interested in Oscan as a language or Oscan in terms of linguistics will nonetheless find it interesting for their own work in southern Italy that the way we date these inscriptions actually may need to change quite significantly. And in all probability, what we'll have to say is actually we just can't get so much dating out of them as we thought we could. So that's a rather negative discovery, but it's also a useful discovery. And it has further implications, of course, for our Greek inscriptions. Just as I said, oh well, if we have a Greek inscription with half H, we can, in 400 BC, we can assume it was available to people writing Oscan in 400 BC. Similarly, it may well be possible that, for example, the earliest instance of lunate sigma in an Oscan inscription is the earliest example of this in the Greek alphabet. And if we believe that these, this is all just the Greek alphabet, that pushes that dating also for Greek alphabet inscriptions, which also tend to be dated on the basis of things like letter shapes. So it can have quite significant implications. Okay, so now I've kind of come back to what I'd quite like to call something like socioscriptics, but I think that's a bit arch, really. So I'm going with sociolinguistics of alphabet use. What can we get about, what information can we get from understanding how you spell when you're writing Oscan about the linguistic situation in southern Italy? Well, one of the things that I've already mentioned is that we have huge amounts of spelling variation. So here is the evidence. Here is this A. We have it in the word poca pid, whoever, which is really poca pid, and that is spelt with an iota. We have it over here in this word that you're now becoming very familiar with, medes. As you can tell, we don't have a lot of Oscan vocabulary available, spelt with an epsilon. And we have exactly, a derivative of this same word, magistracy, spelt with epsilon iota over here. So one of the things we discover is that when you're writing Oscan in the Greek alphabet, this is like a pre-modern, surprisingly enough, a pre-modern alphabet and orthography. You don't have a fixed standard set of spelling rules. Right? It's like pre-modern English. It's like lots of orthographies in this regard. What it's not like, of course, is the standardized educated Latin or Greek orthographies where there are spelling rules. And actually, it's not like the spelling rules of the Oscan alphabet. So further north in Campania and Samnium, where they use the Oscan alphabet derived from the Etruscan alphabet, they have developed a set of rather strict spelling rules. There is spelling variation, but not that much of it compared to what's going on in these things. So presumably that implies some kind of centralized system. This is over really quite a wide area of Italy. It implies a centralized system, or at least formalized system, that allows spelling tradition to be developed and maintained. This seems not to have taken place further down south. I'll go back to this for a minute. I would argue that part of the reason for that is that, so I think essentially everyone, there may be small-scale traditions, but pretty much everyone decides how to spell at any given moment. They're spelling the same sound 3 different ways, off their own bat. And part of the reason for that is you don't need, it doesn't occur to people, or to most people, that you need a set of spelling rules because you already have them. When you learn to write in the Greek alphabet. And so you learn to write Greek, you're taught to write Greek, and you know what the rules are, but sometimes you just write Oscan. And when you do that, you go, well, this sounds to me like a sound that in Greek I would write with an epsilon over here, but further up here, maybe because of fine-grained phonetic differences, or maybe just because of inconsistency, you go, oh, well, this sounds like a sound that when I'm normally writing, I would write with my iota. So there's no need to develop these rules because there isn't people don't think of having 2 sets of alphabets, 2 sets of writing systems. They just think that there is an alphabet and a writing system, and that's the Greek one. You happen to use it to write Oscan. Oscan doesn't necessarily match very well with Greek in all these regards. But the Greek orthography, Greek spelling systems, and Greek education is not necessarily the only influence on people who are writing the Oscan alphabet. Writing Oscan in the Greek alphabet. Obviously, at some point, there's a border where people more or less stop using the Greek alphabet, although a few bits north of that border, and start using the Oscan alphabet. And presumably these people actually talk to each other now and again. There's a certain amount of evidence in the stuff that I've looked at that occasionally people will use spelling rules that match better with the Oscan alphabet than with the Greek alphabet. The kind of brilliant example of this is the inscriptions at Messina, which Catherine mentioned, because there we have evidence from Roman historians and grammarians, oddly, about the Oscan speakers there. So they're a tribe, or a bunch of people called the Mamertini. They moved down there around 300 BC, and they started off in Campania or Samnium. So they, in all likelihood, were originally users of the Oscan alphabet. And indeed, we have a coin with the Oscan letter D on it. Fortunately, the Oscan letter D is very recognisably the Oscan letter D, Oscan alphabet letter D is very recognisable, so we can tell it's in the Oscan alphabet. The tiny number of inscriptions that we have, I think we have about 7 inscriptions from Messina, however, in Oscan, are written in the Greek alphabet. But it's a rather strange version of the Greek alphabet in terms of its spelling. So one of the names that we find here in the genitive is a character called Numpstis, and we don't have this name actually attested elsewhere in the Greek alphabet, but we do have the name from which it's derived, Numpsis, attested down there. And there are various spellings of this name in the Greek alphabet. I think we have this attested about 6-7 times. And this vowel at the beginning can be spelled with an upsilon as it is now, or with an omicron. But whenever you find it down there, it isn't spelt as here with an iota upsilon. But what that does chime with is the spelling of this name in the Oscan alphabet. We have this name attested a lot of times in the Oscan alphabet, and it is consistently spelled IU. So it looks as if this guy, although he's using the Greek alphabet, is spelling his name in the Oscan alphabet way. Similarly, here in the Greek alphabet inscriptions in the south, this is really Numsis, but there's an epenthetic P. Right? You can't say ms very easily without putting a P in between it, and they write it. They either use, in fact, actually, in this word, they always use psi. So this is Numpsis with the epenthetic P written in. But over here in Messina, there's no P written in. We just have Numsties. Again, that matches the Oscan alphabet spelling, where you never get this epenthetic P written. Presumably it's pronounced just as it is in the south, but they don't bother writing it. So in this particular instance, the combination of our historical knowledge and our understanding of how the orthography works, we're actually able to identify a particularly Campanian or Samnite spelling of a name, this guy. Presumably, he is, in some sense, asserting that although his name is being written in the Greek alphabet, he's asserting a Samnite Campanian or Campanian identity, perhaps. So that's a nice example, but there are some sort of more diffuse examples which I won't go into here. So that's kind of the end of my spiel of why you should be interested in Oscan in Greek alphabet Oscan orthography. I'm just going to kind of talk a bit about what I plan to do next. So what I've been talking about up to now has been some of the stuff I've been started working on during my research fellowship, which started 3.5 years ago. And I'm carrying on working on it into the project, and at some point I will produce a book on this. Right? But that won't be the end of the project. For me, we've promised that I will carry on working even after I've produced a book. So what am I going to do next? Well, in general, I want to carry on doing research into Oscan phonology, also perhaps look at some of the other languages of ancient Italy. And one of the ways this kind of fits into our Greek in Italy theme, the linguistic context theme, is to look at the loan words from Greek and also from Latin that are borrowed into the Oscan language. James already mentioned one, kulkfnam. What can we get out of looking at these? Well, one of the things we can look at is what kind of Greek are they borrowing from? So there are Ionic colonies, which James already mentioned. There are also Doric speakers, so at least 2 different dialects if not more actually, of Greek knocking around in the Greek colonies at this time. By looking at the loanwords into Oscan, we can see who they're borrowing words from. So an example here, this is a very famous example, not kind of mine, to Apollo here, Apellune. This, having the E in Apollo, is the Doric form of the name of Apollo. We might be able to say something about the dating of when these loanwords came in, both on the basis of changes that might have happened in Latin and Greek already by the time they come in, and in terms of the relative chronology of Oscan sound changes that we know about. Also what I'm kind of calling, in scare quotes, Oscanization. What do you do when you borrow a word into Oscan? To what extent do you make it fit into Oscan phonology? To what extent does it stay marked with kind of foreign phonology? So an example here, wic, turai, to victory, KT clusters in Oscan got turned into HT clusters. So we know this must be a borrowing from Latin, otherwise you wouldn't have that K there. But obviously in Latin this ought to be victoria, and Oscan doesn't have that iya, it just has a ya, and then subsequently you lose a ya after an R with gemination of the preceding R. So although they haven't changed the KT cluster here when they borrowed it from Latin, they have changed the ER cluster to make it match what's going on in Oscan, to make it more Oscan-y. An interesting case that I just sort of discovered recently, quaestor is not surprisingly a loanword into Oscan, from Latin, means quaestor. Peristyles, of the peristyle, similarly a loanword into Greek. In both of these, for whatever reason, the ST cluster is always spelt with a double S. But in properly Oscan words, ST clusters are just spelt with a single S. I don't know what this means, but it clearly tells us something about A, the phonology of Oscan, and B, the way foreign words were absorbed into the vocabulary and the phonology. So this is going to be the way I move in the future. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.